These are 12-year-old Americans. Like all children their age, their personalities are already well defined.
I'm like kind of the person that won't let anyone like walk all over them or anything like that.
Nobody likes me. I just don't understand why.
I'll do things my way, and if you have a problem with that, keep it to yourself.
We assume that their personalities come from their parents, but a controversial new theory says we've got it all wrong.
Children are very engrossed in being children. To think that they want to be like their parents is like saying that chickens want to be like cows.
Judy Harris is an unlikely revolutionary. A 61-year-old suburban grandmother, she's threatening to overthrow a treasured concept, the power of parents.
In the average American family today, children are the object of more concentrated thought and concern than the young of any previous generation.
For most of this century, psychologists have assumed that parents are the center of their children's world and responsible for how they turn out.
Anxious to bring up their children properly and aware that youthful personalities can be badly warped by mishandling, more and more parents are today turning to such organizations as the Child Study Association of America.
Whether it's potty training or providing the right mix of reward and punishment, the influential role of parents has never been questioned.
Junior, I've called you 3 times. You're going to be late to school.
Until now.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, how much do parents matter?
The biggest worry about this book, it's going to tell parents. It doesn't make a difference
responsible for how their kids turn out. But a controversial new book.
The problem is not that she doesn't have academic credentials. The problem is that she's so patently wrong.
Harris's controversial theory is that children's peers shape their personalities, not their parents.
The press will misread it, people will misread it.
I think I kind of listen to my friends more because they're more on like my wavelength.
She claims that no matter how hard parents try, they can't shape or...
The nurture assumption is the assumption that what causes children to turn out the way they do, aside from their genes, is the way their parents bring them up. It's an assumption that is very much a part of our culture, and I think it's wrong.
It was 5 years ago, in January 1994, that Judy Harris had the idea that would later put her name in headlines around the world. Parents don't shape children's personalities, it's their peers. It came to her one afternoon when she was reading an article which argued that teenagers commit crimes because they want the status of adults.
It suddenly occurred to me that this was not right. If teenagers really wanted to be like adults, they would be doing boring adult things. They would be sorting the laundry or figuring out their taxes. They wouldn't be scrawling graffiti on overpasses or stealing nail polish from drugstores. Those aren't the things that adults do. These are the things that teenagers do. They were trying to show that they were different from adults, not that they wanted to be like adults. And that was the germ of my theory.
Harris thought she was onto something, but she was stuck in the sleepy suburb of Middletown, New Jersey, with no academic credentials or access to a major library. Such a radical idea needed evidence. So she decided to re-examine all the standard child development studies and consider experiments from seemingly unrelated fields. Proving her case would be the intellectual equivalent of David slaying Goliath. But she was so convinced, she was prepared to give it 4 years of her life. "300 miles away in Pennsylvania, the importance of peers is already being taken seriously.
If I were a new kid in this school and you were going to give me some advice, if I came to your school, what kinds of things would I need to worry about getting picked on about? Let me hear from somebody.
You might get picked on for wearing glasses. Like they might call you Four Eyes or something like that.
How many people have talked to their parents about things that happened to them at school and asked...
Jeff Parker is a professor of psychology at Pennsylvania State University. He works in the little-known field of children's peer relations and gives workshops in local schools on peer pressure.
Is there any time when teasing is good?
He is grateful for the Harris book.
I'm happy this controversy has arisen. I have to be pleased that this work has focused some attention on these fields. And if the outgrowth of this is that people are spending more time thinking about the way kids' peer experiences shape them, then I think that's going to be exciting.
Give it away! You're jump for it, shorty guy.
Parker deals with 6 to 12-year-olds, exactly the age, according to Judy Harris, when peers most affect a child's personality.
Ah, you broke it!
Parker is currently working with these 12-year-olds in the 6th grade.
If you were a fly on the wall of a 6th grade class, you would begin to see that kids divide themselves along a variety of ways. They use different labels for different groups to both segregate themselves and also to map the social environment.
Popular girls like us, we're kind of laid back, but we're outgoing and powerful.
Ebony's like me. She's like a leader, not a follower.
What makes girls popular is like the way they dress and like boyfriends. Like if they're popular, then you'll get popular then.
Guys pretty much do make you popular. It depends on who's going out with you. But if I could go out with somebody like Mr. The Joe Bevins, it's very important to fit in. If you don't fit in, you're just like a loser.
If you're like popular, you actually have a reason to come to school because you're friends.
A jock is someone who plays probably a lot of sports. Don't really care what other people think about him as long as it isn't bad.
Popularity comes with being a jock, like with the show.
Oh, I unlocked the door to my new superman.
Judy Harris herself felt the power of the peer group as a little girl.
I was a very rambunctious child. I was very outgoing. I was fearless. I was not at all feminine or dainty the way they wanted girls to be in those days. When I was in 4th grade, we moved to a suburb of New York where the girls were all very sophisticated and cared a lot about looking pretty. I was the youngest in the class and the smallest, and I wore glasses, and I was completely rejected by my classmates. Nobody would talk to me. By the time we got out of that suburb, I was a totally different person. I had become a bookworm. I had learned how to entertain myself. I didn't need other people. I didn't need playmates anymore.
Harris became a successful student. After graduating from university, she was accepted to Harvard's prestigious psychology department to study for a doctorate.
I came to Harvard with the same expectations and hopes that all graduate students come to Harvard with. I found the environment exciting, but not scholastically so, because very little was going on in the department at that time.
Harris was confident her coursework was going well. But at the end of the first year, she received a letter from the chairman of the department, George Miller, informing her that she was unfit to continue her studies.
That letter came as a complete shock. They said that they doubted that I had the kind of independence and originality that they were looking for. And it hurt very badly because I was used to doing very well in academic environments, and this was a failure.
For more than 20 years, Judy Harris has suffered from a debilitating autoimmune disorder. As a result, she is largely housebound. For years, she was a freelance textbook writer on child development, which gave her a degree of intellectual independence not possible if she'd stayed at Harvard.
If I had stayed within the academic world, I would have been indoctrinated. Being kicked out liberated me from all that. It left me with the power to look at psychology from the point of view of a knowledgeable outsider and to see it in a way that an insider couldn't see it.
While working on the third edition of a textbook, Harris was intrigued by some of the discoveries that had been made in a relatively new field, behavioral genetics. They seemed to be challenging a sacred truth of psychology, the power of the parent. She wanted to know more.
Good enough.
Joy Williams and Margaret Bosco are identical twins. Each has exactly the same genes. They were separated at birth 62 years ago and adopted into different families in Sydney, Australia.
Okay, now what I'd like you to do is to cross your arms in the natural way you ordinarily do it. Okay. Very good.
They are just one of over 70 sets of twins that have traveled to the laboratory of Dr. Thomas Bouchard at the University of Minnesota.
Our study of twins reared apart came about entirely by accident. I was in a graduate seminar one evening, and one of my students mentioned that there was an interesting article about a pair of twins reared apart in the local newspaper. And so we brought them here and studied them in some detail. And I must say, everybody was absolutely flabbergasted. They were really similar.
Professor Tom Bouchard from the University of Minnesota started this specific research into twins brought up apart only 18 months ago.
In the early 1980s, Bouchard's twin studies made news around the world. Here was definitive proof that personality traits like shyness, aggressiveness, and friendliness, and even particular tastes, were as much a product of our genes as they were of our upbringing.
And when Tony took this Vatamacum out, I said, "My God, Tony," I said, "that's the toothpaste I use."
Identical twins reared apart were the evidence. Because such twins were brought up in different homes, any personality traits they had in common had to be due to their genes. The results could be applied to the population in general.
Most twin studies seem to suggest that 40 to 50% of the variation among human beings seems to be due to genetic factors. The rest is due to environment and measurement error.
Tell you what, I rather prefer dogs than cats. I'm not a cat person.
No, I'm not either.
But,
For Joy and Margaret, their similarities were apparent from the moment they met at the age of 27.
petrol pumps.
Yeah, petrol pumps.
I felt this love rose up within me. It was dormant, and it rose up, and I had this overwhelming love for Margaret. And I said to her, "You know," I said, "we're really sisters, aren't we?" And it was like a rediscovery, and that was the bonding. They're nice pants. Arby's, yeah, for $5.95. That's good. Yeah,
You wouldn't
that's
want
right.
5 though, would you?
No, but
No,
4
if you had
kids.
a
And Margaret and I were just talked to each other, and we found that we had so much in common. At school, we were good at the same subjects, bad at the same subjects. My favourite colour was Joy's favourite colour. I liked to read books. Joy did too. Same sort of sense of humour. I liked to watch films. Well, so did Joy. You know, it was just amazing, an amazing feeling.
A lot of people say, "Oh, you know, these genetic effects, they're kind of scary. They scare me." I think all you've got to do is work with one pair of identical twins reared apart for about 20 minutes, and that just disappears. Because you see those genetic effects, you see the similarity, but you also see the complete uniqueness of every human being.
I think they're twins. I think that, yeah, you might be right. Oh, I tell you what, 30 years ago, we shy.
The work of Bouchard and the other behavioral geneticists had put the nature versus nurture debate to rest. Clearly, both genes and environment work together to shape the uniqueness of each human personality. But the behavioral geneticists didn't stop with genes. They were as curious about the environment and assumed, like the larger field of psychology, that the home, a child's upbringing, was where the personality was formed. So they compared identical twins reared apart to identical twins brought up in the same home. Clearly, sharing parents would make the twins from the same home more alike. Their findings came as a great surprise and would provide the cornerstone for Judy Harris's theory.
The finding that the shared home environment has really minimal effects on personality, really surprised me. It's not intuitive. You wouldn't think that that's the way the world would work. You certainly would think that because you grow up in the same family and, you know, you're in the same house and the parents have similar attitudes and a similar educational background, et cetera, that this would create similarity between two siblings, between two twins. I mean, it's so natural to think that way. It's like we're wired to think that way, even though that's not necessarily the way the world is. I still think it's surprising. It really is. Your task is to discover which of the two designs is the better one.
Experiment after experiment was showing basically the same thing. Which home a child is raised in, whether he's raised in the Smiths home or the Jones home, seems to have no long-term effects on the personality or the intelligence of the adult individual. And that's an absolutely amazing result.
Ironically, Judy Harris's experience as a mother could itself have been part of a behavioral genetics experiment, as adopted children are also studied to distinguish between genes and environment. Judy and her husband Charlie had 2 children. Nomi was a serious, studious child. Elaine, who was adopted, was extremely outgoing. This became a problem when she became an adolescent.
To put it lightly, it was a difficult period. She refused to accept our guidance. She broke family rules. When we tried to ground her, she would laugh in our faces.
The more that they tried to control me or to tell me what to do or how to do it, the further I would pull away. And so we just got into this really nasty tug of war.
They say, well, you just be firm. Well, firm, I mean, what do you do when your child simply fails to come home?
Eventually wound up mutually with me leaving the home and living with some various friends.
You know, it was pretty hard on them. They were worried about her, and they were right to be worried. I mean, she came very close to kind of not getting back on the right track.
My experiences with Elaine certainly gave me a better appreciation for the power of the genes, and it also gave me an appreciation for the powerless of the parents, because here were 2 children being reared in the same environment, and they were nothing alike, and in fact, we couldn't even treat them alike.
Judy Harris's personal experience mirrored the findings of the behavioral geneticists. They had shown that genes account for about half of the variations in personality from one person to the next. But when they had looked in the home for the environmental influence, what has traditionally been called nurture, they had found nothing. So if parents don't shape a child's personality, who does? Harris thought she might have stumbled upon a possible answer: the peer group. The question was, could she find the evidence? Judy Harris knew that she could no longer write traditional textbooks for a living. She had come across too many studies, including the findings of the behavioral geneticists, that contradicted the nurture assumption. The psychology establishment had chosen to ignore them. She felt she couldn't.
I knew that there were things going on in child development that I had sort of stored in a separate compartment of my mind and had there for years that didn't fit into the traditional view of how children developed, and that I didn't find a place for in my books.
One such study was the work of child development specialist Carolyn Rovey Collier. Rovey Collier has proved that infants as young as 3 months have the ability to remember a game in which they control a mobile's movement by kicking their feet. Children are introduced to the game, and after a break of 2 weeks, the experiment is repeated using the same blue and red crib liner, what Rovey Collier calls the training context.
If they are tested in the same context, in the presence of the same distinctive crib liner that they were trained in the presence of, they kick like a son of a gun. Some of them may kick 20 or 30 times a minute in the presence of the original training context.
But when the researcher changes the context, putting a new liner around the crib, there's a surprising change in the baby's behavior.
When you change a crib liner, infants do not recognize the mobile they've been playing with for days. It doesn't matter how familiar the objects are they're interacting with. They absolutely don't recognize them. They treat it as a different event in a different place.
What that tells us is that things that children learn in one context, in one situation, those things are not necessarily dragged along into another context, another situation. That means that what children learn at home may not necessarily go out of the home with them.
Roe v. Collier's work was one of several studies that seemed to confirm Harris's instinct that a child's experience is divided into the world of the home and the world outside the home, and that these two worlds were totally separate. But where was evidence that the world outside the home, specifically the peer group, is what matters? She found a clue in an unlikely place, the field of primatology. Because we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees, researchers have recently argued that studying them can reveal what is innate in human psychology. For Judy Harris, the study of chimps suggested that the way to understand humans, and particularly children, is as members of a group. The animals' feeding habits are a good example.
People often think that they hand each other food, they give it to each other, but that's very unusual. Most of the time, one of them has food, like that female on the climber there. So she holds the melon and others can reach in, can get something from her. But they're selective in that, and they don't allow everyone to get in there. And sometimes you see them scream at each other, and that means that they're refusing someone in there. So it's a selective process.
It was really a lot of fun to read about the chimpanzees, because here I was seeing the same thing going on in a non-human species that I was talking about in humans. I was saying evolution designed the human to be a group-living animal, as our ancestors have been for millions of years. And so evolution didn't design the child to be raised as a single unit, separate.
The chimpanzees had provided Harris with a crucial piece of her argument. But she needed to show that group living was more than just about survival. It could actually shape individual personality. It was then that she came across the work of sociologist William Corsaro.
I see childhood as another culture. And my goal is to find out what it's like to be a child in the group, to be a participant in the group. And I like to let children draw me into their group in that way.
Everyone get in the house and I'll build.
Corsaro's nursery school studies, the product of years of painstaking observation of the minutiae of children's interactions, have been largely ignored by the psychology establishment. He argues that the pretend play of children is far more complicated than meets the eye.
This is not a rocket, it's a rocket ship. Yeah, you drive. You don't drive, Luke, but you're just the captain.
They're creating a theme in which they're appropriating information from the adult world. The example of what a spaceship is and where you might go in a spaceship. But there's a lot of looseness to how the play can be expanded.
Doggy, you can be a working doggy. You better get back on.
Devin came in, for example, and replaced Austin, who is a dog. And he said, I don't want to be a dog, I want to be a cat. Then he became a super cat that ate insects and spiders and so on. So even though all those things exist in the adult world, there's a tendency to put them together in ways that we might not.
This is my part of the rocket that I own. That's their part that they own. They can come over if they want to, but I'm just gonna tell them, don't come over very often.
some children become very good at certain aspects of the peer culture. We're all doing this together, but this kid's really good at, let's say, building these kinds of structures, or telling jokes and laughing and being funny and so on. And I think that certainly within group activities and group culture, those experiences contribute to individual personality.
Michael wants to get out.
Hey, no! He says he can have it there now. Go!
Wherever I looked, it seemed that there were things going on that the larger field of child development was paying no attention to, but that did fit into my theory. Bill Corsaro was saying that children make their own cultures at the very first point where they're able to get together with other children and to communicate with them. My idea came from teenagers, but now all of a sudden I saw this can even apply to preschoolers, to 3- and 4-year-olds. Amazing.
No, dude, come on. Alex, dude, do it really quick. I got itchy powder. Dude, if we put some itchy powder on somebody, we're gonna get detention automatically.
My policy that I will not permit any April Fool's jokes of any kind inside this room.
Itching powder! Itching powder!
For April Fool's Day, me and my friend Evan, we got stink bombs.
Oh, we're going this way.
According to Harris, by the time they are 12 years old, the peer culture has already been children's most important world for some time, leaving the world of the parents on the sidelines.
Once I had found Bill Corsaro's work with nursery school children, I saw kids as much more empowered, as much less sort of an accessory of the adult world. They have their own world, really. And in their own world, they're important people.
That would be so fun.
To think that children want to be like their parents is like saying that chickens want to be like cows. They are two different species. They have their own world, their own life, their own things that are important to them, and they're not necessarily the things that are important to their parents.
We're the normal group. We're like not the popularist, but we're like popular, but not too popular.
I don't think I'd like to be popular because people would be talking behind my back.
Normal people know how to have a really good time, but not get in too much trouble. We care about our grades more than some people. I mean, we don't want to be dumb.
The popular people, they're always goofing off.
They think that it's like cool to be bad and stuff, and it's not that cool to be bad.
We're sitting here over there. Over there. Every like group has a table. Like me, I sit with this group, like the normal people, like not too popular, but not too like, you know. But like I switch different tables. I have like 3 different tables. I sit with Kim, like that's a little lower. They're not like, they're normal, but they're a little bit lower than the normal, just a little. And then I also go to Nicole's table, and they're like really normal, but they're a little bit over normal, just a little bit. And then I sit with the really popular kids sometimes. And people look at that, they really do.
I love you. Here, you
I know, oh my God, get away from me. I love you too. Get away.
The least important thing happening here today is getting food in the body. The most important thing is these kids, this is the midday planning meeting. This is the point in the day where kids get a little bit of time without a lot of adults sitting around looking in to make their connections with their friends, to set their agenda for the afternoon, to figure out whether that fight that happened this morning is over or whether it's still going on.
Julia's not sitting with us, I guess. She hasn't said a word to us all day. They're ignoring me. I said, what's the problem? They keep on ignoring me. I think that's a little rude.
Oh! How dare you!
We like to think that children have nothing better to think of than what they're going to do when they grow up. This isn't what childhood is about. Children are very engrossed in being children. Their goal is to be a successful child, not to become an adult.
I'm not talking to her.
Judy Harris was convinced that children have their own world. But could that world be powerful enough to shape individual personalities? And if so, how?
I have no clue what's going on between you guys. I really don't.
Best friends. Well, I don't care, and I don't like the way your tone of voice is. Now, I'm telling you one more time, I have to talk to you.
After a year of research, Judy Harris decided that if she could find enough evidence for her theory, she would try to write an article for one of the most prestigious academic journals in the world, the Psychological Review. She knew it was a long shot. After all, she was a complete unknown, and her health was beginning to seriously deteriorate.
The autoimmune disease had begun to attack my heart and lungs. If the attack on my heart and lungs had continued, I would have been dead within a year. So at the time that I started on this work, I wasn't at all sure that I would live to complete it. And so I felt a sense of urgency. If you're gonna die at 59, you wanna leave something behind you, something that will live longer than you lived.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white t-shirt.
Then came a small breakthrough. Harris was struggling to show that peer groups exert subtle power over individual members. She decided to re-examine a landmark study on conformity by social psychologist Solomon Asch.
You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length.
In Asch's 1953 study, 5 accomplices all give what is clearly a wrong answer to a simple visual puzzle.
2. 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
What Solomon Asch showed was that groups don't push, they pull. The desire to conform comes from the person, not necessarily from pressure of the group. It's a very strong desire, and it's one that people are not aware of until they find themselves at odds with their group. And then they find themselves in distress. Why are they thinking that while I'm thinking this? What's wrong with me?
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. This man has apparently been in groups before.
People are designed to identify with a group and to conform in some way to that group. It's not something that children really have to learn. It's how they're built.
Skaters are people that like wear baggy clothes, like big shorts like I have on, Billabong, Jinko stuff. Some people skate, some people rollerblade.
Some people pose.
Some people BMX. Like
BMXing's awesome, bro.
Yeah,
It's the best
it's
of them all.
It's hard if you're a new kid because you won't have anybody to talk to, really, that's your friend. 'Cause if you try too hard, you just look kind of dumb.
He's a skater, and like he wasn't popular, and now he is because he's like friends with Alex and Mark and stuff, and they're like really popular.
Dude, I know, and the bus driver doesn't care. Evan's like, everybody's butt up in the air.
Yeah, it's so fun.
Dude, and we flew forward in the seat. We almost got in a car accident.
People like people to skate. Like right now, they like skaters better than jocks. I think it's hard not to be in the cool group because you just don't have as many friends. You only have like 5 maybe, and if you're in the cool group, you have like 15.
Yeah, do you have $5?
I have 20.
As people think about peer pressure, they often think about direct peer pressure.
I have a...
But there's also a more subtle, insidious kind of peer pressure, and that's the kind of peer pressure kids apply to themselves. It's a sense of internal pressure to do things, to fit in, to belong, to be part of the group, or to enjoy a common shared experience.
What's your definition of popular? Like, known by a lot of people or liked by a lot of people?
Or have no friends, like Nick Brazzers.
Man, he's such a poser. Dude, his face is like a baby's butt. His cheeks are just like soft.
It's like Justin Missouri.
Oh, yeah.
His head lopsided.
This is his first year in State College, and I was kind of nervous about how the kids would make the adjustment.
He's just a poser.
I think he fits in pretty well. My main source of information is his sister, but she said that he's popular. She's not real big on popular people. She sometimes says that the popular people aren't quite as thoughtful, maybe, as they should be.
While kids try hard to fit into the group, for some, like Colin, acceptance comes with trade-offs.
You having a good time with these guys?
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah?
They like beat me up a lot though.
Do they? Why?
Yeah, Ron. I don't know. Ron's just weird sometimes. He's just like that.
Why are you guys picking on Colin, Alex?
He's the easiest, he's the littlest.
Colin, you okay?
Yeah, it's in my head.
Judy Harris felt she had evidence to show that groups had the ability to seduce children into conforming, but she knew she had to answer one final question. Despite the power of the group, each child is affected differently. What could account for that?
Because of what Prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess, Mr. Correctional Officer. Because of what
These are not prisoners, and this is not a prison. They are college students, and they were part of an astonishing experiment. At the police station...
Harris knew she was close to the answer when she looked at a 1971 study conducted by Stanford University. The psychology department had created a prison as a quasi-laboratory to push conformity studies to new levels. The participants were ordinary university students.
They were led to a simulated prison block consisting of 3 small cells and a closet designed for solitary confinement. This would be their entire world for 2 weeks.
And they'll have no privacy at all. Their cells...
The study was the brainchild of psychology professor Philip Zimbardo.
Surveillance. Nothing they do will go unobserved. They have no...
Taking advantage of new video technology, he decided to record every aspect of the experiment with a hidden camera.
Part of this experiment was designed to look at and to understand how peers influence one another through modeling, through conformity pressures that they put on one another. Because an important aspect of human nature is the influence that friends, peers, and the social setting have on human behavior.
24 healthy, well-balanced young men were randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners. The guards received proper uniforms and truncheons. The prisoners were stripped, deloused, dressed in smocks, and assigned numbers.
At first, the guards were still groping for things to do to the prisoners, so they fell back on the familiar military technique of ordering push-ups to humiliate them.
On day 2, the prisoners staged a rebellion to assert themselves. As punishment, the guards removed their beds.
This is unbelievable. They took our clothes. Hands off the door. They took our bed. They took our bed. Hands off the door. Wait till the door. Get up.
All those young men who had been assigned to the prisoner role very quickly began to identify with the other prisoners. Similarly, the guards began to think in terms of us versus them.
Hey! I don't want anybody laughing.
What was unexpected was that this began to happen within 2 days, and that these two groups, which started off the same, began to separate until they were totally different groups.
The first 2 days of the prison study were showing that the pressure to conform is increased when there is more than one group, like rival gangs in a playground.
Philip Zimbardo's study of prisoners and guards found that you can take a homogeneous group of people, divide them arbitrarily into 2 groups, give them different names, and they will be at each other's throats.
Will you get out here and do 5 push-ups, because I don't think that was singing.
What that tells us is that we cannot really assess the psychological status and capabilities of a human without also assessing his or her group relations.
The popular people, they're always goofing off.
Girly girls like try too hard or something.
They talk about behind your back.
And they're like,
They're like make fun of you because they don't want you to get popular.
Come on. Get in that closet then.
That's prisoner 416 on the floor as he was forced into solitary.
On day 3, the study took a bizarre turn. One of the prisoners, in an act of individuality, began a hunger strike. His fellow inmates could release him from confinement by voting to make a small sacrifice.
You can give me the blankets and sleep on the bed and mattress. Or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day. Now what would it be?
The vote revealed the price of nonconformity.
We got 3 against 1. 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
The guard who devised the vote revealed another dynamic within groups, how individuals naturally gravitate to different ranks or positions.
The guard who behaved most brutally, who prisoners nicknamed John Wayne, because he took on a kind of southern drawl and acted in a kind of, reckless American cowboy style. He was an intelligent college student. In fact, his father is a famous physicist at Stanford University, comes from a very good background. But as he got into that role and began to push the prisoners and dominate the prisoners, he began to enjoy the power of that role.
You should act it out. And I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love 2093.
I love you, 2093.
Get up close.
I love you, 2093.
You smile, 293. You get down here and do 10 push-ups.
In his mind, he said once they rebelled, he would stop, but they never rebelled. And so he kept doing it more and more extreme.
What if I told you to get down on that floor and fuck the floor? What would you do then?
The peer group had temporarily transformed the behavior of these young men in just a few days. Harris believes that during the formative years of childhood, the peer group has a permanent impact on personality and works in 2 distinct ways.
The peer group doesn't simply act to make people within a group more alike. The main way the peer group shapes the personality is by differentiating among the members. People within a group have different statuses within the group. Some are looked up to, some are ignored, some are followers, some are leaders. A child who has been a leader in the peer group all through childhood is going to end up with a very different personality from one who was at the bottom of the totem pole.
If you're not popular, you sit by yourself, you feel like a loner, people call you a loner, so you basically are a loner.
The loner group, no offense, but Elaine, she sits at the loner group. There's this kid in our class, Elena. She's like not one of the popular ones. She can be a jerk. I'm not very nice to her, and she's not very nice to me. She wears really tight pants, and those like used to be in style, but now they're like...
A lot of the popular kids try to boss me around like they're my superior, and it's just dumb. The populars are like always wearing like something that says Gap or Jinko on them.
oh, there's been oh, we gotta get stuff for it, please.
I don't buy my clothes based on brand.
Cargo pants are totally in. Bell bottoms, like, totally. Like, everything is just fashion. If you don't dress right, you don't fit in. If you don't fit in, you can't get popular. That's my philosophy.
And I think most of the popular girls are snotty, rich kids.
She's like a goody-goody, like a whole lot. She always has her homework done.
The popular kids made fun of her. Now she's just not popular.
I think my personality is I'll do the things my way, and if you have a problem with that, keep it to yourself.
Spend any time watching a group of peers, and immediately you'll begin to see there's always a set of roles available to kids to take on. Some children will have more influence and more power and more stature than others. Sometimes kids deliberately set themselves apart because they're often very different individuals. And there are children who immediately will jump out to you as someone who's isolated or rejected or lacks a role in the group, or someone who's constantly victimized.
Do you have trouble making friends?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, I just don't think anybody likes to talk to me.
Kyle Harpster sits behind me on the bus. He's not a popular person at all. He's like one of the loners.
Because I tried making friends, but they just ignore me, and I just don't understand why.
I think he's actually kind of nice, but he's more of like a mama's boy. Like, it's sort of hard not to make fun of his weight.
It'd be unrealistic to imagine that being chronically rejected by peers, being a child who's constantly left out, who sits up in a classroom and looks around and realizes the 24 other individuals in this classroom don't like me. It would be surprising to think that that experience doesn't have long-term negative consequences for their personality and behavior. We know that kids with that experience are at risk for things like leaving school early, doing poorly academically, getting involved in high-risk adolescent behaviors, delinquency, adult criminality, and even mental health referrals as adults.
While there has been some research on the long-term effects of rejection, there have never been large-scale studies that treat the peer group as the focal point of personality development. As a result, not even Harris herself can guess at the effects that different peer groups, or ranks within them, might have on a child's personality. However, Harris has succeeded in forcing the academic establishment to consider a radical alternative to the idea that a child's upbringing is the source of personality. And she started a debate that will continue for years to come.
Judy Harris's book is really challenging. In a sense, Judy says, this emperor has no clothes, that the evidence for all these parental influences is exceedingly thin. Now, she has a theory. It requires a lot more evidence to bring to bear, but it's a challenging set of ideas. I think she's done a real service to psychology by providing it.
I think Judith Harris's theory is on the mark. Psychology got so entrenched in the idea of parents that it took someone bringing together work, as she did in her book, from a variety of sources, bringing it to bear on this point and saying, look, shouldn't we rethink this? There's an alternative.
I think peer relationships play a powerful role in children's development and personality development. So it'd be very tempting for me, I think, to jump on a bandwagon and say, gee, peer experiences are the critical experiences and parental relationships are not. But I also think that would be naive.
She doesn't look at enough evidence which contradicts her point of view, and that certainly is one weakness. But a lot of important ideas in our culture, in our society, in the history of our culture, have come from people without PhDs in psychology.
While it's too early to know whether Harris's theory will be confirmed by research, she has at least been accepted back into a peer group that once shunned her. She recently received the highest award from the American Psychological Association for her article on her theory. Ironically, it's named after the former dean, George Miller, who kicked her out of Harvard nearly 40 years ago. Her book, meanwhile, has been translated into 13 languages and was a runner-up for a Pulitzer Prize. With her health improved, Judy Harris often looks back to the moment when she had the idea that changed her life.
It was like a gift. It was like the gods were making up to me for all the bad things they had done to me. I had suffered a great deal of pain over the years. And now suddenly they were making it up to me in such a wonderful way that it was all worth it.